Hello, History 72A, Winter Quarter 2024. We are about to start Module B for the course, which will take us into what's called contact, meaning that Europeans sailed across and made contact with the people who were living in the Americas, North and South. For this module, we will be discussing the meeting of two very broad sets of people. So not two different peoples, but two sets of people, each set with completely separate histories, and each set made up of many, many groups, each with their own complex interlocking histories. In this lecture, we will be using this quote from historian Ramon Gutierrez as a way to introduce both the political power of history and the realities of what happened as Europeans crossed the Atlantic Ocean in increasing numbers. The quote reads, "The conquest of America was not a monologue, but a dialogue between cultures, each of which had many voices that often spoke in unison, but just as often were diverse and divisive." I like this quote, but I have found before that some students misinterpret it. The misunderstanding tends to happen at the word dialogue. Gutierrez intended the first meaning in the dictionary, any conversation at all involving two or more people. Full stop. People who misunderstand the quote generally assume that Gutierrez meant the third definition of dialogue, an exchange of ideas or opinions on a particular issue, especially a political or religious issue, with a view to reaching an amicable agreement or settlement. European explorers and colonists, on the whole, were neither amicable nor agreeable, even to one another. I've realized that both monologue and dialogue in the Gutierrez quote make the most sense if you know the transition in America's approach to the study of the contact between Native Americans and Europeans. This part of understanding how the history of history itself can change a story and why we need to keep track of all historical contexts involved in the production of the history we are studying. It will also help me set up the big picture for Module B as a whole. In the third part of Lecture 5 here, we will continue our theme of trying to pen down how to communicate history when the communication we are using as evidence has been fraught with layers of complications and misunderstandings. Maps played a part in European exploration, not just in terms of finding routes from one place to another, but in controlling the narratives of contact. Hopefully, this is something that you pick out when you read the primary source you have by Columbus, where he names the islands. If you have never tried to draw a map without the internet or satellite data, or even a photo from a balloon, but only from the vantage point of human height, you may not realize how difficult it is to make a map or how many choices you make without really thinking about it of what to include and what to leave out. It is a fun experiment to have someone take you to a place they know but you do not. It does not need to be wilderness. It could be downtown Davis if you don't go there very often. Your friend doesn't give you any information. They just make sure that you have a ride home and companionship while you're wandering around. Try mapping the area. No phones or other electronics allowed unless you lose your friend and need to get them to come pick you up. This is a paper and pencil or pen task. If you want to make your life a little more interesting, give yourself a time limit for how long you are able to explore. If you really want to experience frustration, you can take notes on what you see and even map a bit as you go, but then you have to go back to your own space and try to draw a map from your notes, but for a much bigger region than the bit that you saw. If you really, really want to share your frustration, get another friend, give them the notes from your visit, and ask them to draw the map. That might give you an idea of what early cartographers or map makers from Europe were facing when they started to sail in any direction except through the Mediterranean. The map on this slide was drawn in 15 1745 and only looks like the maps we have now in a very few places. It's not just the shape of the continents that is not quite right. Relative distances are also off. So this is meant to be North America, Central America, and South America. So they kind of sort of have this coast here a little bit. The red arrow on the right points to Africa. The purple circle is around Cuba, and the yellow and orange arrows point to India and China. This map was made about half a century after Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and the Caribbean and Central America are the most recognizable regions. The greater part of North America appears not to exist at all. Now, Columbus believed until his death that he had reached Asia, even though other Europeans figured out fairly quickly that he had found a land that was new to Europeans. North America, of course, was not new to the people who lived there. The meetings between two sets of groups, again, not just two groups, but two sets of groups from continents on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, happened over a period of more than 300 years. European exploration and settlement was not a swift, steady, inexorable process. It took a lot of time and was an uncertain enterprise through most of the time period covered by this course. Nevertheless, this map here and the book is basically the history of European arrival in North America that my sisters, who are about a decade older than me, got in K-12 in the late 1950s through the 1960s. This is what Gutierrez meant when he wrote at the beginning of the quote I shared, "The conquest of America was not a monologue." The history that my sisters were taught was a monologue, a story told from a single point of view, that of one group of English-speaking arrivals from England. Honestly, when it comes to geographical information, this map is about as informative and reliable as the 1545 map we just looked at in the last slide, and it serves much the same purpose. Neither of these maps is going to help you get anywhere, but giving places names of their own and drawing maps is a way of projecting power, whether it is 1545 or 1954. You'll notice that the Pilgrims took off from Plymouth, England, and landed on Plymouth Rock. I guarantee you that was not the name of the region before they got there, nor for the people who lived there at any point. In 1954, the U.S. was well into the first phase of the Cold War following World War II. The Communist Control Act, outlawing the Communist Party in the U.S., passed in that year. Although the McCarthy witch hunts for supposed communists of the Red Scare were about to wind down, the Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, ending legal segregation in U.S. public schools, although making very little change to actual segregation on the ground. This that you see on the slide is very much a celebratory map made by white English-speaking Americans in 1954. North America is united as a continent with the assumption, which students at the time would get, that the United States stood in for or represented all of North America. Europe is all one region on this map, unified up to the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union, which would be off the right side. Europe is represented by England. France would be a little surprised to notice how tiny they are compared to the British Isles there. And England is the only country named on the map. Africa is one undifferentiated red blob. This would be a great primary source, this map, for the understanding of the first half of the Cold War, but it is a bit thin on actual 17th century history. By the time I got to K-12, the map of European arrival, and it was always phrased as arrival or discovery, never colonization, it looked a bit more like this. You can see the different colors represent different countries now: Spain, France, Britain. England is not the sole representative of Europe. France and Spain actually exist, but the map does not show Europe. It shows North America. The names of the countries on this map are Spain, France, and Britain. They don't even say British claims in North America. Again, this tells you something about the worldview of the United States in the latter half now of the Cold War. If we look at this map on the right, it's labeled the Three World Order. Although ostensibly covering the full Cold War, this depiction really represents the 1970s to 1980s phase of the Cold War. It may be difficult to see the key, but blue represents the first world or free world. The pink is the communist world, and the green is the so-called third world. The US and the Soviet Union spent my entire K-12 years trying to control the countries in green. Meanwhile, people in the third world countries either made diplomatic and commercial ties with one or the other of the superpowers or hosted, in quotes, a hot war, meaning a proxy conflict between the US and USSR, or Soviet Union, in which many, if not most, of the war casualties were the people who actually lived in the so-called third world. If you look closely at this map, you will find that the word free is in scare quotes for the first world, and that the pink is actually labeled second world before communist world. And no one in the second half of the 20th century in the United States called the pink bit the second world. It was always the communist world. That cued me in that this map was made more recently. It looks just like the maps I always saw in social studies classes in my K-12 years, except that those never put free in scare quotes. And they might just put the word communist and leave off the world part in the pink. But it was never labeled or spoken of as the second world. When K-12 noticed this inconsistency, there's the first world and the third world, there was a perplexed discussion that went along the lines of, I just thought about this. There's a first world and a third world. Why no second world? Second person. There must have been a second world back in the old days, and it just doesn't exist anymore. But the names of the first and third stay. Somebody else. Maybe it means Russia, by which the speaker actually meant the entire pink region. Another person. Nah, that's always been the communist world. The Cold War was our historical context and had been for our entire lives. Lest you think I am exaggerating, one of the required courses that we absolutely could not get out of in high school by any means was A versus C. That stood for Americanism versus communism. It did not matter the political stance of the student. We all hated that class. But enough pleasant reminiscing. That pleasant part is sarcasm, just in case that's not clear. We will leave the green third world on the right and go back to the age of exploration map on the left. The green on the left-hand map is labeled unexplored, as if no one had ever been there at all, negating on the map that it had been rather thoroughly explored and was filled with lots of people with their own histories and politics. The next slide has late 20th century white stereotypes of Native Americans. So somehow Native Americans were known to have existed, but they never actually made it to the map. We did hear about Indians, but the images that we saw were like this. On the left, or this one on the right. Native Americans were presented in much the same way as people in the so-called third world nations in the second half of the 20th century. In other words, as well-meaning and quaint, but in need of white people to care for them. Also, during my K-12 education, there seemed to be only a few tribes, and I am putting tribes in scare quotes there. The Cherokee, the Navajo, and the Sioux, or if you lived in parts of New England, maybe the Mohawk. And these groups were usually chosen to stand for what textbooks called Plains Indians. The history presented was a single story, still the history of European men in the so-called New World. If Indians, or women for that matter, appeared, they were part of the set or the background to the so-called real story. To return to the Gutierrez quote from the beginning of lecture, the first half of the quote reads, "The conquest of America was not a monologue, but a dialogue between cultures." When people react negatively to the word dialogue, they interpret the word dialogue as representing the fantasized image on the left. But that image is really still a monologue. Mono is one, log specifies speech. Literally, a monologue is a situation in which one person is speaking alone. There may be two groups depicted in this image, but there is only one group using the picture to tell a story. The image is a great illustration for studying mid-late 20th century American educational propaganda that presented white Americans as the saviors of everyone else. But it does not represent anything that any serious American historian would call a dialogue. I've juxtaposed the 1980s view to a more recent map of European exploration of the Americas. The map on the right gives a better idea of what the process, and it was a process, actually looked like for Europeans. The lines represent specific expeditions, and the color of the line tells us which country in Europe funded the expedition. The funded part is important. If you look at Columbus down here, you may already know that his expeditions were funded by Spain, but Columbus was Genoan, not Italian, but Genoan, because in the period shown on the map, there was no Italy as a country. Europe was just starting to consolidate into nation states. Nation states with supposedly firm, clear borders are not an inevitable way of dividing people and governments. In fact, European monarchies were just beginning to consolidate land and power to the degree to form nation states. These explorations on the right-hand map were a major part of gaining wealth and power for the Western European groups over here. Incidentally, somehow Portugal is not on the map, even though the ships that Columbus and other explorers used were designed by the Portuguese, and the Portuguese claimed the eastern region of South America, what is basically now Brazil. This is the same map, but I've tried to focus in a little bit on North America here, so I can highlight a few things. This map seems quite active, as if there were European ships busily zipping back and forth over the Atlantic. But if you look at the dates, if your screen size permits, you will see that this represents journeys that took place over the course of several centuries, all squeezed onto one image. So Sir Walter Raleigh here, 1585, 1586, the French exploring the Hudson Valley, 1610, La Salle, 1679, Cortez in Mexico, 1519. So this is over a period of time. Each of these journeys took up most or all of a year, sometimes longer. If you look at De Soto's expedition in the southeast here, winding around, it took place over a period of 3 years. And the explorers, not just the big names, but the sailors and the soldiers, might or might not make it back to Europe. It was basically 50-50 odds that they would die before heading back east through the Atlantic. What does this tell us? It tells us the map of my childhood, the one that split the continent up between Spain, France, and Britain in solid yellow, blue, and red was a lie. European monarchies claimed large areas of North America, often without having a clue of what those areas looked like. But they did not actually control the regions they claimed at this point, with the possible exception of the Spanish after destroying the Aztec Empire down here. You may also notice that all of these expeditions followed waterways, coastlines, and river systems. Europeans had very little knowledge of the interior of the North American continent for much of the 300 years or so of exploration, resource extraction, and colonization. Europeans, over the course of 300-ish years, chipped away trying to gain footholds in North America. They did not arrive in an empty, unexplored land. They did not control the continent of North America, either quickly or completely. They did manage to get some of what they wanted. First and foremost, these explorers, and even more the governments that funded them, wanted power. And for all of them, but particularly Spain, France, and Britain, recall there was no Italy, and there also was no Germany as cohesive nation states in this period. All of the colonizing nations calculated that they could achieve the desired increase in power in Europe by raiding the Americas. For the European colonizers, the Americas seemed to offer three important benefits. All three of the most persistent occupying nations pushing into this hemisphere, Spain, France, and Britain, wanted all three of these things. First, to extract resources, think especially gold and silver, and get rich. Second, to claim land. And third, to spread their own brand of Christianity as part of the process of nation-state formation. Europeans were also fighting one another in Europe over religion, as well as over the succession of monarchies. So all three European countries wanted what I will abbreviate as resources, land, and religion. But all Europeans did not want all three of these benefits the same amount. And European colonizers certainly did not succeed in getting all three, resources, land, and religion, to the same degree. Why do we, in this class, care about the Europeans in the late Renaissance and early modern periods? Because European interactions with the people already in Native America still have meaningful residues in our own lives. People in this region, claimed by Spain beginning over 500 years ago, now mostly speak Spanish. Not exclusively, some pre-contact languages are still spoken, but by adulthood, many people communicate in Spanish at least some of the time. Portugal's claims are the reason that Portuguese is the official language of Brazil. I've noticed that California folks are not as aware of French colonization as people in New York. I'm from the East Coast. And that makes sense because you know more about California than people in New York do. The French settled in this region along the Great Lakes and river systems around them, including the Mississippi River, which is why Montreal and Quebec speak French, as well as some people down here at the southern end of the Mississippi River in what is now Louisiana, including New Orleans. As for the blue lines, they are one of the reasons that I am teaching this class in English, although you would not necessarily think that English would end up the dominant language if you only looked at these events through the 1600s. We also care because colonization was not a monologue. There were already North Americans, and despite the efforts and claims of American education in the 20th century, the continent that the Europeans encountered did not look like this on the slide, with an undifferentiated mass of folks lumped together as Indians. Nor did North America look like either of these maps, in which the arrival of Europeans in small numbers constituted immediate control, no matter how much European countries wished for this to be true. North America looked more like this. These are not countries shown here in the different colors and patterns, not countries in the way that nation states conceive of borders and power now. But remember, a large part of Europe, think Italy and Germany, for example, was not organized into nation states either. That change was closely linked to the whole project of European colonization that we've been looking at, part of in the last few slides. What you see here on this slide is the distribution of North American language groups just before Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, or at least this represents the best estimate of linguists at the moment. Each of these language groups could be divided into separate languages, and each of those had their own histories and their own ways of organizing themselves and their world, meaning that this is a better representation of North America than my sisters and I were taught. But this map is still a simplification of far more complex relationships seen from the outside, and it only applies to one historical moment. To go back to Gutierrez, the conquest of America was not a monologue, but a dialogue between cultures. He meant that Native North Americans shaped American history, or really histories, at least as much as Europeans. Gutierrez continues with respect to what he calls cultures to say, each of which have many voices. Now, I think it's unfortunate in some ways, a lot of ways really, that he used the word culture to stand for continents and all of the cultures that Europe and the Americas each had within them. But realizing that he meant two long settled and varied regions, two separate continents that had been separated from one another for at least 10,000 years, then from the time Columbus hit the Caribbean, 1492, until the early modern period, 1600s, North America looked more like these two maps combined, but constantly shifting and responding to who was meeting whom and for how long. So, how do we talk about the meetings of so many different constructions of societies and such a varied kaleidoscope of worldviews in order to make sense of the things that took place then to our minds now without warping all of it too terribly much? As you may be aware from earlier lectures, I am uneasy splitting sex and gender into distinct categories, one of which is assumed to be largely fixed, sex, and one of which is assumed to be malleable, gender. But the way that gender is used in these phrases that I'm about to introduce to you grows out of that creation of two heuristic categories. I've put a definition of heuristic on the slide here, and heuristic is a mental shortcut commonly used to simplify problems and avoid cognitive overload. Heuristics are a method of simplifying reality in order to try to figure out the answer to a problem without all of the messy confusion presented by actual reality. The separation of sex and gender, as we often use the word concept packages now, was an heuristic device and should not be taken as a dogmatic truth. So, for these terms, take gender to mean more influenced by society than by the body. But remember that creating categories to help us sort and understand our world is useful, but those categories do not reflect some sort of objective underlying truth. The word content package for gender is very much in flux at the moment, in our culture right now in the moment. So we will use a definition for gender that can be helpful, but keep in mind always that this is not any sort of natural law. You will see gender used in different ways around you even now, and certainly in the past. So I've defined gender here as something, a trait or behavior or value, that is more influenced by society than by the body. And that's the definition that we will use in these, but not the only definition you will see in the class. So the terms are, and I will go over them individually, gender roles, gender systems, borderlands history, and gender frontiers. If you look for an explanation of gender roles online, you end up with something like one of these two. The role or behavior learned by a person as appropriate to their gender according to prevailing cultural norms, or the public image of being a particular gender that a person presents to others. Noticed that the second definition uses one of the two words in the phrase it is defining in the definition, and the first definition manages to use both words in the phrase to define the phrase. It's a bit like explaining what a cat is by saying it's a cat. If you Google around for what people think gender roles are for Americans right now, you will get a ton of different answers, most of them either doubling down on or actively pushing back against the image shown here. Note the word traditional that you are forbidden, absolutely forbidden, to use in written work for this particular class. You can see here the behind the scenes work that tradition does in normalizing one particular set of gendered expectations in American society. Traditional for whom? From when? The use of the word allows the user to elide over precisely those essential questions. What we see here on the slide are hegemonic American gender roles. The point is not that people actually fit into them. Most people do not, even if they are trying very hard to do so, which is, of course, part of the power of this cultural system that we are calling gender roles. In America, most of us are aware that the hegemonic expectation is that people will be either men or women, and that depending on the group to which they are assigned, the sorting bin within the category, they will behave in different and supposedly characteristic ways. Most of us are also aware that reality is not well represented by that particular system of gender roles, but divisions of power are well represented here, including by what is not shown. And it does not matter that the images seem somewhat sympathetic to the woman, just like the wear the pants posters and ads. The meaning and the cultural force of that meaning in our lives is effectively conveyed. You did all notice his trousers emphasized in the drawing, right? And that the man is flipping a coin. In our society, where money and power are inextricably linked, she holds the symbol for drudge labor, and he not only holds the symbol for power and wealth, he is tossing it nonchalantly in the air. American culture at the moment is ordered by particular ideas about sex, and I am deliberately using the word sex here. I am going to say for us, the term gender roles can be a useful shorthand for understanding social expectations in any particular historical context. But, and this is a big but, we have to be careful not to assume that all societies must be sorted by sex. We need to be sure that we are not just seeing what we expect to see. We need to pay attention to the bins that are used to sort people according to sex, if they are used. And we need to be really, really careful that we do not just assume that the society we are looking at constructs sex as a binary, only men and women, only two possible sorting bins. We have to pay particular attention to the way that those societies that are sorted by sex define not only behavior expectations for males and females, but also what parameters that society used to sort men from women. If we are careful, we can use the concept of gender roles to study power structures in a society. I am redefining gender roles a bit here. It is a mouthful, but I can mostly live on with it. Gender roles for Karen's HIS72A are the hegemonic, or for us right now, most powerful expectations for behavior that a society organized by sex as an axis of power assigns to each division or sorting bin that they apply to their category of sex. Taking time to note that gender and sex are not universal categories. Understood in reliable ways is something that I feel strongly about. But you should be aware that not everyone, not even everyone in the history department here, approaches this topic the same way as me. I'm not telling you this to give the impression that I think my colleagues at UCD or anywhere else in the field of history or out are wrong and only I am right. Word concept packages are slippery things, even for people in nearly identical contexts. And the sex gender word concept packages have been at the center of conflicts over power in ways that make misunderstanding quite likely if we are not using them in the same way as one another in our dialogues. Note that the particular combination, gender roles, is only, as far as I am aware, applied to the category of sex currently. And you can think about what that means and what history it reflects, because the US certainly has age roles and socioeconomic roles, and I think you could go on from there. In the interests of time and of being not entirely horrible to those of you watching this lecture in full, I'm going to put the definitions of the three other phrases that I showed earlier on the next few slides without commentary, or at least without a complete Karen-style commentary that goes on forever. I think that you can apply the considerations and caveats we've been thinking about to all of the phrases, and you should. You do not need to have precisely the same hesitation and caveats that I do. In fact, I expect that you will think of things that I've overlooked or have an entirely different set of concerns. That's a good thing. I do want you to examine these definitions and not just accept them without internal comment. You can and probably should look at other definitions for these phrases, and you should write your own definition for each term, preferably one that does not just paraphrase, but takes on the deeper meanings that you pull out. A gender system. Gender systems are these social structures that establish the number of genders and their associated gender roles in every society. A gender role in this is everything that a person says and does to indicate to others or to the self the degree that one is either male, female, or androgynous. Borderlands history, in the broadest sense, North American borderlands history encompasses the interactions between different peoples, empires, and nations in the continent's past. This approach considers borderlands to be contact zones where no single group rules supreme. Gender frontiers, historian Kathleen Brown coined the term gender frontier to capture those sites of cultural contact where multiple groups of people tried to make sense of seemingly alien notions of marriage customs, the sexual division of labor, or the meaning of motherhood. One of your readings for this module is by Kathleen Brown. I like her definition here mainly because I can see her trying to eliminate as many assumptions as possible. At a certain point, we have to communicate with one another, so we have to use words, and those will never perfectly convey what we want to say. One of the skills that I would like you to explore this quarter in my class is the distinction between critique and criticism. You may, of course, criticize anything about the course and definitely about historical actions and decisions. But when it comes to formal writing that you do for the class, I would like you to focus on developing your critique skills. A critique is evaluating a theory or practice in a detailed and analytical way, versus criticism is the expression of disapproval of someone or something based on perceived faults or mistakes. These things are related, but the basis and approach are a little bit different to the two of them. I am going to end this particular lecture here with the big picture containing 3 centuries of complicated borderlands and gender frontiers. Next time, we will head to the southwest region of North America and focus in on example of gender frontiers there. Your chapter by Juliana Barr from the monograph, the book, Peace Came in the Shape of a Woman, is from a book examining gender on the Texas borderlands. The gender frontier that I will talk about in the next lecture will be in the region of what is now New Mexico. This map is from the 18th century, in other words, the 1700s. And Florida is a bit strangely truncated, but you can generally tell where we are heading. As we go, compare the contact zones to Gutierrez's points of dialogue, each meeting in that dialogue arising from its own historical context and creating its own historical context within the overarching world of Native American encounters with European colonizers. Before the key points for this lecture, I will leave you with the full quote from the beginning of lecture. The conquest of America was not a monologue, but a dialogue between cultures or continents, each of which had many voices that often spoke in unison, but just as often were diverse and divisive. Key points for Lecture 5. Native Americans, indicating the peoples of an entire continent, first met Europeans, the peoples of another entire continent, beginning when the Taino encountered Columbus in 1492 in the Caribbean. The process, which resulted in Native Americans encountering more and more Europeans, lasted for 300-ish years. There was no empty continent found by Europeans. The Europeans did act as colonizers, but they were not immediate or complete conquerors. Both North America and Europe encompassed a vast number of peoples, all with different histories and different ways of constructing their societies. Each meeting between any of these peoples was unique, creating its own effects in the larger historical context, linking continents on the east and west of the Atlantic Ocean. Familiarize yourself with the terms gender role, gender system, gender frontier, and borderlands. Consider more than one definition and think about how these terms will show up in the class as we go on. Evaluate what is useful and what is limiting in each term. Practice critiquing the terms. Critique and criticize mean different things. The coda for this lecture is on maps. Remember that codas are for fun. I will never ask you about the material in them for anything graded. The collection of purposes that maps may serve, shown on this slide, was compiled by a group of students from a previous class of mine. So maps may be for directions. They may be for decoration, projection of power, demonstrating technical know-how, displaying patriotism, studying history, instilling a sense of wonder. They may suggest mastery over nature, reinforce faith, explain relationships beyond spatial, convey a sense of progress. They may mock power, signal wealth, or show loyalty. Note that these functions are not mutually exclusive. Maps usually serve more than one purpose at a time, and I'm quite certain that we do not have an exhaustive list on the slide. You could think about all of these purposes for the different maps on the slides coming up. Maps and globes are related for obvious reasons. It's mostly whether they exist as flat, two-dimensional representations or three-dimensional objects that take up greater space, usually. The object that you are looking at on the right here is an armillary sphere made in the region of Italy in the 1600s. Armillary spheres are early astronomical devices for representing the great circles of the heavens. Basically, the sphere is a skeleton celestial globe with circles divided into degrees for angular measurement. An elaborate armillary sphere could show the horizon, median, equator, tropics, polar circles, and an ecliptic hoop. This particular piece was made of gilded brass, walnut wood, and stained beech wood. The diameter is 18.5 centimeters or a little under 7.5 inches. Armillary spheres had a practical function in charting the movements of stars, planets, and constellations. But as you can see here, they were also often beautiful objects in their own right. This engraving, called a perpetual wheel, shows 5 concentric circles for finding sunrise, the phases of the moon, mobile feasts, the Dominical letter, don't ask me what that is, the golden number, and the epoch at any given time of year. Basically, a perpetual wheel is a map of stars over time. The one shown here was produced in Italy by astronomer, mathematician, and all-round expert in science, as it was known and defined at the time, Antonio Santucci. This was printed at some point between 1582 and 1613, although there's no date on it, so I will explain how we know that. It was dedicated to Christine of Lorraine, wife of Ferdinand I de' Medici, and it includes the Medici-Lorraine coat of arms. That's up here. And the way that we are able to date this particular thing is by the marriage and lifespans of the two people with the crest. This map links spatial knowledge to time and to power. There is a tiny armillary sphere drawn in the center that I've enlarged to the right. Even enlarged, it may be difficult to make out, but these two fellows are making calculations using a terrestrial globe on the bottom middle here and a celestial globe on the upper right. The last two objects could actually be used in practical terms. You might have a bit of difficulty finding your way around New York City using the maps on these Manolo Blahnik shoes. You might think about why the map is of New York City and what purpose it serves beyond the obvious decoration. In other words, why use a map as decoration on a pair of shoes not meant for walking long distances on New York pavements? These are a size 7.5, and they were on sale in 2022, marked down from $4,002 to $3,403, plus free shipping. It kills me that free shipping would be an attractive deal when you are shelling out $3,000 for a pair of shoes. This may be one reason why I don't have Manolo Blahniks, or however you pronounce it. This map on the top here, made in 1806, shows the Red River in Texas and Louisiana. From the Spanish camp, where the exploring party of the U.S. was met by Spanish troops, to where the river enters, the Red River enters the Mississippi River. This map is quite detailed along the Red River, but not beyond it. It shows cities, towns, Native American settlements, and geological features. But it doesn't just lack detail elsewhere. It does not show surrounding regions at all. The design of the map makes more sense when you see the location of the Red River Basin relative to a map of the U.S. in 1806. The green in the full map shows the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which increased the size of territory claimed by the U.S. considerably. Lewis and Clark's expedition is shown in red in the north. Our map here was drawn by the Freeman Curtis expedition of 1806, and it is right in this area of the Texas-Louisiana Gulf, where the precise boundaries between American and Spanish claims were likely to be contested. So this map is a depiction of a geographic area, but it is equally intended for international politics taking place well away from the Red River itself. In Europe's Middle Ages, for this example on the slide here, think between 1000 and 1400 CE, when Europe was big on the Crusades, the Mappa Mundi, or Mappae Mundi, literally map of the world, interpreted and mapped the world in spiritual as well as geographic terms. East was always at the top of the map, south was on the right, and west at the bottom with north on the left. Jerusalem, the center of the Christian world, was always the center of the Mappa Mundi, even if it was not labeled. The continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, were always arranged in the same way. On the left is a basic template for a simple Mappa Mundi. It's fairly easy to see why this type is known as the TO map. A Mappa Mundi would never have looked like the map on the right. All of the countries are modern that are labeled there, but it shows how our world now might look if charted according to the formula of a medieval Mappa Mundi. The English were particularly keen on Mappa Mundi. You are looking at the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, probably one of, if not the single most famous example of a Mappa Mundi. It was created in Lincoln in England in the 1290s, drawn in great detail. The text on it could only be read by people who spoke Norman French, the language of the literate secular elite. The images, however, would have been legible to all, and in fact served partly as a teaching device to educate the common folk, which is why this one has always lived in a place of Christian worship. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is illustrated with biblical events, and Christ is shown sitting in judgment at the top, although that's rather difficult to see here. But biblical images are only a small part of what is on this map. This one is illustrated with drawings of cities and town, as well as stories and characters from classical mythology. There's a minotaur depicted on the map somewhere, and I found it once, but I don't remember where it was. There are pictures of plants and animals, some of them based on explorers' tales described in variable degrees of fantasy. These animals include camels, elephants, and lions, and among the birds are parrots and a phoenix. There are also people, as well as creatures not entirely unlike people. You might think about how this map fulfills the majority of map purposes on the first slide of the coda here. The Hereford Mappa Mundi measures 64 inches by 52 inches and was drawn on a single sheet of vellum. Think of vellum as calf skin processed to look like parchment or heavy paper. I've tried to enlarge some parts, but it gives you only the slightest idea of how fascinating this map is. Hereford Cathedral, Hereford Cathedral, has a website linking to another website entirely devoted to this Mappa Mundi. It's worth playing with these sites to appreciate this map more fully. This is the map of the several nations of Indians to the northwest of South Carolina, more commonly known as the Catawba deerskin map. And it is, as you may have surmised, drawn on a deerskin. The full shape is indicated in the image on the upper right. You can see where the legs were and the little head used to be. The Catawba presented this map to Francis Nicholson, who was the colonial governor of South Carolina around 1721. He was the colonial government. That's around when the map was given to him. The U.S. did not exist as a country until 1776-ish, so the date of 1721 here tells you that we are talking about a British colony when we say South Carolina and not an American state. The map is a stylistic representation of the Indian nations between Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina, and the colony of Virginia. The map is oriented so that the southerly features are on the left side and the northerly on the right, near the deer's head. European settlements are depicted in squares and straight lines, while Indian nations appear in circles. The Nassau is shown as the central community of the Catawba Nation, appearing in the center of the map as the largest circle. Rather than emphasizing geographic accuracy and scale, the map focuses on the network of relationships between the Indian nations themselves and between those nations and the English. The black and white image bit left of middle on the bottom is a 21st century map showing the same geographic space in terms more legible to us now. And you can see that the circles and squares are completely oriented differently and differently sized. So this is a relationship of communal structures, whereas this is a geographic representation. This map does not and cannot convey the complete information encoded in the original deerskin map. This map, the Catawba map, is a popular teaching device now, partly because it is one of so very few that were made and or preserved by Native Americans. If you want to know more, you can just Google Catawba map, CATAWBA, and find many sites with information, including the Library of Congress. This is, in fact, the type of primary source, this map, that you could use for your class project. This map, drawn by a man named Nicholas de Fer between 1646 and 1720, is titled here on the upper right corner. So you can figure it out despite my egregious pronunciation. La Californie ou Nouvelle-Caroline, Teatro de los Trabajos Apostólicos de la Campa e Jesus en la America South. The map is hand-colored and measures 45 by 66 centimeters and basically shows what we would now call Mexico and California. I've enlarged part of it to show San Diego. Consider what the specific place name suggests to an historian considering the name of the map overall and the historical context surrounding its creation. This map, drawn in 1685 by Jean-Baptiste Louis Franklin, shows French claims in the region of the Great Lakes. It covers part of Canada, the Hudson Bay region, and what is now the eastern United States. Drawn with pen and ink and watercolor, this map shows lakes, rivers, villages, and other geographic entities. This map, like the Spanish example on the previous slide, has a rather lengthy and grand title. I won't torture you by trying to read the entire title to you, but the title translates into English along the lines of North America composed, corrected, and augmented on the basis of journals, memoirs, and most accurate observations which were recorded in the years 1685 and 1686 by several individuals. This is a map of New England. Johann van Keulen, who drew it, succeeded a generation of earlier Dutch cartographers or map makers. In 1681, he published the first part of his 5-volume Sea Atlas. It appeared in further editions carried on by his son. This chart shows the fishing banks in the Gulf of Maine and details the coast between Cape Cod and Cape Sable. Until the late 18th century, voyagers from Europe found their way to North America by dead reckoning, the compass, the chip log, and the lead line. Latitude measurement was available, that's the side to side, but there was not yet a reliable way to determine longitude, that's up and down. Charts were poor, and there were limited sailing directions for Maine. This map came out in 1700. Dead reckoning in navigation is the process of calculating your current position of some moving object, so assuming you're on a ship, by using a previously determined position or fix, and then incorporating estimates of speed, heading direction, and course over elapsed time. So you can think about measuring speed out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This map is from Mercator's Atlas of 1613. You may recognize Mercator's name from Mercator projection, an approach to representing a three-dimensional world in 2 dimensions that would simplify navigation using the instruments of the time. Gerardus Mercator was an engraver, craftsman, mathematician, and cartographer born in 1512 in Flanders. the Low Countries region, think Belgium, Netherlands, and so on. His best-known work was the volume of maps, which contains the example shown here. Mercator's book of maps was the first to have borne the name Atlas, after the Titan of ancient Greek myth, who was said to hold up the world on his shoulders. In 1569, Mercator devised a rectangular map with straight lines of latitude and longitude crossing at right angles. It was intended to be a new way of representing a round globe on a flat sheet of paper. This Mercator projection swiftly became the standard map projection used for nautical purposes because of its ability to represent sailing routes of constant course and straight lines. You will notice that this is not the style used on the previous maps. Although the Mercator projection uses a linear scale, which is equal in all directions, it does exaggerate the size of land masses near the poles, making countries such as Greenland appear far larger than they really are relative to equatorial land masses. This is a fan used for cooling yourself. It's from the late 18th century, the late 1700s, and it actually was physically used for cooling. It's made of paper, painted paper, and ivory. The paper is engraved and hand-colored with maps, and I won't torment you with the French on it, but it shows a map of Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And the French text is urging a canal by way of Lake Nicaragua that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And this also has colorful figures called the Four Parts of the World, gazing intently at Mercury, god of beginnings. So there's clearly a political stance to this map, projecting French power in the 1700s. And in fact, the French did not succeed in building a canal, although they did work on it for a while. The US built the Panama Canal under Teddy Roosevelt in the late 19th century. This is a celestial globe with clockwork. It was made in Vienna, Austria in 1579, and it is made of partially gilded silver and brass. The globe once rotated, charting the constellations. This is a unique object uniting extraordinarily complex mechanical technology with great aesthetic beauty. It belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who displayed it in his curiosity cabinet. It was valued both for its function as a scientific apparatus and for its rich, elegant casework. Pegasus here bears the seemingly weightless globe on his outstretched wings. Astronomy was enabled by the knowledge of arithmetic and geometry, and those were then considered, arithmetic and geometry, the wings of the human mind. This is a map of the London Tube, not scaled to represent constant distances. So like the New York subway or the Paris metro, underground trains, you can find your way from one place to another above ground by tracking the trains and connections. But this is the actual course taken by the tube tracks under London. So if you try to use the previous map to find your way around on the surface, you will have a more difficult time. This is a map of King's Cross, which looks somewhat complicated, but really was not that complicated. When you get down to it, it's fairly straightforward. This is a German bombing target map of London's docks during the Blitz, and it depicts regions already destroyed in green. The London Blitz, which began during the Battle of Britain, started in September of 1940 and continued into 1941, so not in this class. London's docks and the East End suffered badly. The code name Sea Serpent, and my German pronunciation is even worse than my Spanish and French, but this name Sea Serpent was probably derived from the sinuous shape of the Thames River as seen from the air and as shown in plan on maps. With the German attack on Russia imminent from mid-1941, so we're talking World War II here, Air attacks on Britain diminished as the Luftwaffe formations were transferred elsewhere. This is a map of gender-inclusive restrooms at UC Davis, and it might seem like there are a lot of them, and I'm sure that UC Davis was very proud of it. But I also know that if you are the one actually looking for a restroom, they don't seem that numerous. This is a map of the Death Star, the Social Sciences and Humanities building where the History Department is located. This is only the first floor. The History Department is on the second floor. People call it the Death Star because there are different doors that are locked and unlocked at different times because the architect wanted people to appreciate the building, which is nice for the architect, not so nice for you if you are working on a schedule. And this is a map of UC Davis. The arboretum is marked with these green shapes. This is a satellite map. So we look at it for accuracy. We find ourselves our way around, but you might also think about which countries have the luxury of having satellites in space that do maps and which companies have access to the data coming out of those, meaning that this map shows you more than just spaces. It also tells you something about power distribution in the world right now in the early 21st century. I initially wrote this coda not long after we experienced a rather dreadful year of fires and bad air quality. Purple Air was a company that showed air quality in different colors using sensors. And these sensors were owned or bought by both individuals and by public buildings. Purple air is a measure of relative affluence or wealth. Vacaville has a population of 100,000 people. These are the sensors that have been bought in Vacaville. Davis has a population of around 67,000, and you can't even see the city under the number of sensors that are distributed here. I am ending the coda here on maps that you saw in lecture with a reminder that maps pretty much always project power.